Namaste. In this lecture, we shall explore historical evolution of sustainable development. Our focus is the long journey from direct human dependence on ecosystems to the modern idea that development must remain compatible with ecological limits, social well-being, and long-term survival. Here is the roadmap for today. We begin with the simple fact that human societies have always depended on ecosystems. Then we look at how early development was closely tied to visible ecological limits. After that, we examine how industrialization changed the scale of extraction, production, and damage. We then turn to the emergence of sustainable development as a corrective way of thinking. And finally, we connect this history to biodiversity and ask what lessons it offers for present day sustainability. Let us start with a very basic but very important idea. Human life has always depended on nature. Food, water, energy, shelter, and materials did not come from some separate economic world. They came from ecological systems. And this is also one reason why early humans so often depicted animals, plants, hunting, and other elements of nature in rock paintings. Those images reflect a world in which daily life, survival, and meaning were closely tied to the natural environment. This means development never began outside the environment. Development began inside the environment. Sustainability starts from this reality because if the natural base weakens, the human systems built on it also become vulnerable. When we look at early human life, this dependence becomes very clear. Food came from land, water, and biodiversity. Through farming, fishing, hunting, and gathering. Shelter materials came from forests, soils, grasses, and other local vegetation. Water systems shaped where people could settle and how they could survive. Even climate and seasonal changes directly affected livelihoods. In other words, ecosystems were not optional supports. They were the conditions that made life possible in the first place. Because this dependence was direct, many societies developed an awareness of environmental limits. People learned from ecological feedback. If land was overused, future harvests could fall. If water was mismanaged, scarcity followed. Seasonal cycles also shaped when resources could be used and when restraint was necessary. Local knowledge often reflected this practical understanding. It may not have used modern scientific language, but it often recognized that nature could not be exploited without consequences. Building on that idea, early development remained closely tied to the ecological context. Agriculture depended on fertile soils, reliable water, and reasonably stable local conditions. Settlements often formed near rivers, forests, coastlines, and other resource rich areas. And this was not accidental. It showed that livelihoods depended on the local ecosystems. When ecological disruption occurred, survival itself could be threatened. So, in early historical settings, the link between development and environment was usually direct and visible. This visibility mattered a lot. Crop failure was not just an agricultural problem, it had social consequences such as hunger, migration, and conflict. Water scarcity influenced where people could live and how communities organized themselves. Forest decline reduced access to fuel, timber, and other everyday materials. Ecological stress was therefore difficult to ignore. It appeared in daily life, in work, and in survival. That is one reason why environmental limits were often understood in practical terms, long before sustainability became a formal concept. So we can now state a larger principle. Development was never separate from nature. Human systems were always built on ecological foundations. Nature was not merely a background for human progress, it actively shaped production, health, transport, settlement, and security. The economy and the environment were linked from the very beginning. What changed later was not the existence of this link. The link continues, but our willingness to recognize it clearly. Sustainable development made that connection explicit once again. The next major shift came with industrialization. Industrialization increased extraction of resources. It expanded fossil fuel use. It accelerated production and it allowed transport over much larger distances. These changes greatly increased human power over materials, energy, and landscapes. But they also increased the scale of environmental impact. Forests could now be cut faster, minerals could be extracted more deeply, waste could be produced in larger quantities, and pollution could spread further. The human relationship with nature now entered a new phase. Industrialization was different not only because it produced more, but because it changed speed, scale, and distance. Extraction and manufacturing happened faster. Impacts spread over wider areas, and the source of a resource became more distant from the place where it was consumed. And this made ecological damage much easier to hide. A city could enjoy goods without directly seeing the forests being cut, or the rivers being polluted, or the habitats being destroyed elsewhere. Distance created convenience, but it also reduced ecological visibility. At the same time, we should be fair in our analysis. Modern development also brought real benefits. Infrastructure improved, production increased, medicine, communication, and transport advanced. Mobility expanded, and economic opportunities grew for many people. So, the historical story is not simply one of good versus bad. Development improved many aspects of human life. This is important to remember because sustainable development does not reject that progress. It only asks how progress can continue without destroying its own ecological base. However, alongside those gains, the cost of modern development also became more visible. Pollution increased in air, water, and soil. Ecosystems started to get damaged. Habitats were converted for agriculture, industry, infrastructure, and urban expansion. Resource depletion intensified as extraction moved faster than replenishment. These burdens were also unevenly distributed. Some groups received more benefits, while others faced more pollution, more displacement, and greater ecological risk. This tension is central to the history of sustainable development. Growth improved many lives, but ecological systems were weakening at the same time. Progress and damage were occurring together. And this meant development could no longer be judged only by immediate output, income, or infrastructure. It also had to be evaluated by its long term effects on ecosystems and society. That shift in evaluation is one of the most important historical steps behind sustainable development. As industrial and modern development expanded, environmental problems became harder and harder to ignore. Air pollution affected health and visibility. Water pollution harmed rivers, lakes, groundwater, and communities that depended on them. Deforestation changed landscapes and weakened ecological functions. Soil degradation reduced agricultural productivity in many areas. Species decline signaled deeper ecological instabilities. And these were not isolated incidents. Together, they showed that development could undermine the very systems that support lives and livelihoods. Pollution entered the conversation. It revealed that waste does not simply disappear. Its effects can remain for a long time and move through air, water, soil, and food chains. The bald eagle shown here is a well known example. In the United States, the national bird suffered a major population decline linked to DDT, a pesticide whose effects moved through ecosystems and harmed reproduction. This became widely recognized through the broader public discussion shaped by Silent Spring. The lesson was clear: damage could continue long after chemicals were used, and harm could appear far from the original point of application. Out of sight did not mean harmless. Pollution forced societies to think about long term ecological consequences rather than short term convenience alone. Resource depletion added another warning. Some resources were being used faster than they could recover. Even renewable systems such as forests, fisheries, or soils could be overused if extraction exceeded regeneration. In that case, short term gain reduced long term availability. We can also connect this idea to the oil crisis of the 1970s, which made it clear to the world that resource supplies could be disrupted and that modern economies were highly vulnerable to shortage. Development then began to face clear ecological and material limits more openly. And this was a major historical lesson. A resource being renewable does not mean that it is safe from depletion. And even non renewable resources can expose how fragile development becomes when it depends on heavy extraction without long term planning. At the same time, social inequality sharpened the environmental issue. Environmental harms were not equally shared. Some communities faced more exposure to pollution, scarcity, displacement, or degraded living conditions. Access to clean resources was also unequal. This brought justice into environmental debate. The question was no longer how much damage was happening, but also who benefited and who paid the cost. Sustainable development therefore developed as both an ecological as well as a social concern. All of this led to a broader shift in development thinking. Development was no longer seen as automatically positive simply because it increased production or consumption. Long-term consequences became central. Ecological concerns entered economic discussion. Growth alone was no longer enough as a measure of success. We began to ask whether growth was durable, equitable, and compatible with environmental systems. And that intellectual shift prepared the ground for the idea of sustainable development. The central historical question can now be stated very simply. Can societies improve human well being without destroying the systems that support that well being? This is the core tension behind sustainable development. It is not an abstract puzzle. It arises from a real historical pattern in which development produced benefits but also weakened ecosystems, reduced future options, and created social inequities. Once that pattern became visible, a new framework was needed. Sustainable development emerged as that response. It was a corrective idea. It challenged growth that ignored ecological accounting. It connected present welfare with future welfare. And it brought environmental limits into the center of development thinking. The point was not to stop development, but only to redefine it. Development had to be judged not only by what it produced now, but also by what it preserved or damaged over time. A landmark framing of sustainable development came from the Brundtland Report, which gave the idea its most widely cited expression. It brought together four essential points. We must meet present needs. We must not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. We must recognize that needs are real and important, and we must also recognize limits. This framing became influential because it joined human well being and ecological responsibility into one clear idea. It tells us that sustainability is neither anti human nor anti development. It is about continuity, it is about fairness and long term viability. The word needs mattered because sustainability is not anti human. Basic well being remains central. Food, water, health, shelter, and dignity cannot be treated as secondary concerns. Essential needs deserve priority, especially where people still face deprivation. This also brings equity into the concept. If some groups lack basic needs, while others consume far beyond necessary, the problem is not only environmental, it is also social and moral. Sustainable development therefore includes fairness within the present as well as fairness across time. The word limits mattered just as much. Nature has carrying capacities. Resource use cannot expand endlessly on a finite planet. Pollution can exceed what ecosystems can absorb safely, so it must be kept in control. Technology can help us use resources more efficiently, but it does not erase those boundaries. And this is a crucial point. Sustainable development is not based on the assumption that innovation makes ecological limits magically disappear. It is based on the understanding that human systems must operate within those limits. The idea of sustainable development became globally important because environmental problems were no longer confined to one place. pollution crossed borders, and this became very clear through issues such as acid rain and the ozone hole. In both cases, the causes and effects were not limited to a single local area. Emissions released in one place could contribute to ecological damage elsewhere, and that made purely local solutions completely inadequate. Resource pressures also became international. Climate concerns grew, and biodiversity loss came to be understood as a global issue. The panda shown here helps illustrate another important part of that history. Certain well known animals came to serve as flagship species, meaning species used to draw public attention to wider conservation problems. The giant panda became one of the best known examples, especially through organizations such as WWF. This helped people connect the face of one recognizable species with the larger issue of habitat loss, ecological decline, and the need for international cooperation. In that way, development debates widened beyond local and national concerns into a truly global conversation. Even so, sustainability is not one fixed formula that looks identical everywhere. Different places face different ecological pressures, economic conditions, and social priorities. A dry region, a forest region, a coastal city, and a mountain village may each need different strategies, but the core requirement remains the same. Development must be capable of lasting. Long term viability is the common principle, even when local paths differ. This history matters because it helps us understand how unsustainability develops. It often appears gradually, not suddenly. Hidden costs accumulate over time. Damage may be delayed or displaced. By studying the historical evolution of development thinking, we learn why present environmental crises did not emerge just by accident. We also improve our present day judgment. We become better able to ask whether a proposed action creates durable well being or only a temporary gain. Now we can connect this history directly to biodiversity. Biodiversity decline became an important signal of ecological stress. Species loss often reflected deeper damage in ecosystems, not just isolated decline. Habitat destruction became a major warning because when habitats disappear, ecological relationships break down as well. In this way, biodiversity entered sustainability thinking not only as a conservation concern but also as an evidence about the health of development itself. Biodiversity also became important as an indicator of system health. Diverse ecosystems often reflect ecological integrity, functional relationships, and adaptive capacity. By contrast, simplification can signal degradation. When many species disappear and only a few remain, resilience may weaken. The system becomes less able to absorb disturbance and recover. This is why biodiversity became more than a specialist topic. It became a way to judge the condition of wider ecological systems. This leads us to a practical connection. Biodiversity supports ecosystem functions such as pollination, nutrient cycling, soil formation, water regulation, and biological control. These functions support ecosystem services, and those services support health, food systems, livelihoods, and local economies. So, biodiversity matters directly to development. If biodiversity declines, the effects may eventually appear in agriculture, water security, disease risk, and economic vulnerability. The link is ecological, but it is also social and developmental. This slide brings the argument together in a simple image based form. Nature is the base of development. Settlements, infrastructure, and livelihoods are built within landscapes, not outside them. Whether we live in rural or urban settings, our systems still depend on land, water, climate stability, and ecological functioning. Development may look human made on the surface, but it continues to rest on natural foundations. A key lesson from history is that unsustainable development can look successful at first. Production rises, consumption expands, infrastructure grows, but that damage may appear later, sometimes much later. Ecological decline can accumulate quietly until a threshold is crossed, and by then, repair may be costly or difficult or sometimes even impossible. Sustainability therefore asks a deeper question than immediate success. It asks what remains over time. Does the development process leave behind durable capacity or only a long term loss? And this is why sustainable development is not anti development. It does not reject progress. It asks what kind of progress can endure over time. It seeks better development, not no development. Durability matters alongside growth. A project that creates rapid benefit but destroys soils, forest, water systems, or community security may not be true progress when viewed over a longer period. Sustainable development asks us to widen the time horizon of judgment. Sustainable development is also about justice. We must consider benefits and burdens together. Access to resource matters. Exposure to risk matters. Vulnerable communities often face greater environmental harm while having fewer resources to adapt. Fairness is therefore a part of sustainability, not an optional addition. A development path cannot be called sustainable if it protects wealth for some while transferring environmental costs to others, especially to those already at risk. If we reduce the historical lesson to one line, it is this: development without ecological accounting creates long term costs. This idea helps us interpret real ecological situations. Whenever we study land conversion, pollution, species loss, or climate stress, we should ask whether short term gain is creating a deeper long term burden. And this history still matters today because the same tensions continue in new forms. Growth still creates trade offs, and biodiversity loss still warns us that ecological systems are still under pressure. The image here is a striking example. These are not ancient objects, they are modern keychains made with embedded insects, which shows that even today, living beings can be reduced to novelty items, decoration, or amusement. That may seem small when compared with major drivers of biodiversity decline, but it belongs to the same larger pattern. Alongside habitat loss through deforestation, climate change, melting glaciers, ocean acidification, microplastic pollution, and many other forms of environmental damage, there are also cultural and commercial practices that treat biodiversity as an object to package, display, and consume. So the pressures on biodiversity are not only large scale and industrial, they can also appear in everyday markets, habits, and attitudes. Many present crises are therefore updated versions of older patterns, now operating through modern economies, technologies, and consumer culture. And that is why sustainability remains a practical necessity rather than a slogan. It asks us to question not only major industries and policies, but also smaller practices that normalize the reduction of nature into a community without regard for long term ecological consequences. And that is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.